When the first white settlers came to Indiana Territory, they met Native Americans that told them vivid, strange stories. The Piankashaw Indians told them about giants that roamed the dark land across the Ohio River in what's now Indiana. They were feared by everyone, and the Indians even knew some of their names. White settlers dismissed these stories as folklore, a good campfire story, and didn't take them seriously. But as they began taming this vast wilderness, cutting down trees and plowing fields, they began finding ancient burial sites. We now know these to be over 4,000 years old. And some of these tombs were a disturbing find, the bones of giants, just like the native people had told them. While many were 6.5 feet tall and not enormous by today's standards, quite a few ranged from 7 to even 9 feet tall. They were found at places like Walkerton, LaGrange, Portland, Muncie, Anderson, Newcastle, Crawfordsville, Shelbyville, Brewersville, and on both sides of the Ohio River in both Clarksville, Indiana and Louisville, Kentucky. These pioneer stories are fascinating, but are any of them true? If so, where are these giant skeletons today? The answers might truly surprise you. All along the Ohio River, between Charlestown and Evansville, are giant stories from hundreds of years ago, and backing them up are odd places and artifacts. The Piankashaw Indians told about a giant people that lived near the falls of the Ohio. They were very feared and dominated the region. The chief of these giant people had a large bathtub along the river made of stone. This was pointed out to early settlers in the 1800s. A bathtub big enough for a giant would really be something to see. However, in the 1920s, the Army Corps of Engineers installed a series of locks and dams along the Ohio River. Any such natural bath would be under at least 15 to 20 feet of water. In fact, the area between Louisville and Clarksville is an astounding 168 feet deep. Presumably, it could still be down there, but the water is so murky that it's nearly impossible to see anything even a few feet away. But a giant bathtub is only a minor part of the story. As told by the Piankashaw Chief Tobacco, after many seasons of living in fear, the ancestors formed an alliance among the many Indian tribes, made many weapons, and attacked the giants where they lived. It was nothing short of epic, and a battle for survival. When the battle was finally over, many braves had fallen, but the giants were all dead. If there was a gigantic battle like this, there would surely be skeletons and weapons as proof. And there was. In 1778, General George Rogers Clark was building a military base on Corn Island. His men found countless bones all over it. As recorded in his diary, they simply threw them into the Ohio River. They were preparing for a war with the British, not a museum. The same was true on Sand Island, near Clark's cabin. Bones were strewn all over it, utter chaos. However, if there was any shred of skeletal evidence left on Corn Island, the Army Corps of Engineers destroyed it. To allow boats to pass over it, they blasted it with dynamite. The entire island is now underwater. Not to mention the Ohio River floods. after the massive flood of 1937, it's doubtful that any bones at all would be left on top of Sand Island. None of the bones were saved to measure and determine if some of these belonged to giants, but there are other unusual things to measure. Along the Ohio River, where the Piankashaw spoke of the battle against giants, thousands of arrowheads and spear points have been discovered. It's a favorite place for relic hunters and has been for several hundred years. If you knew nothing about the Indian story, you might still think a gigantic battle was staged from both sides of the river. It's as if an unescapable gauntlet, a kill zone, was created with no possible escape. This would make sense if ancient people thought people living at the falls would hop on a boat and try to get away downstream. But where would all the weapons have come from? At Mockport, at a place called Swan's Landing, thousands of rock flakes were discovered along the Ohio River shoreline. Sitting under the camouflage of cool trees, people were napping rocks to make sharp points for countless arrows and spears. They weren't messing around, it was a weapons factory. In 1878, Indiana State geologist Edward Cox mapped Wyandotte Cave in Crawford County, finding an ancient underground mining operation. Using tree bark for torches, ancient people walked into the darkness. They chipped off pieces of chert to make weapons of the finest quality, sharp enough to slice through paper. As the crow flies, the ancient mine is less than 2 miles from the Ohio River, where finished arrowheads and spear points of Wyandotte chert have been found. However, it's only a half-mile downhill to Blue River, making it an easy trip by canoe to the Ohio River in the alleged gauntlet. But if these were weapons made to fight giants, what were the giants using? That might be a lot more interesting. Inside the IU Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology at Bloomington is a tantalizing clue. What looks like a very large spear point, as big as a man's forearm. Heavy enough on its own, but imagine its weight on a wooden pole. A person using such a weapon would have to be pretty big. But archaeologists don't think this is a spear point. Instead, they think this is a gardening tool. But why is the razor-sharp point buried in the handle? These large spear points, some much larger than this one, have been found throughout Indiana, Wisconsin, Ohio, and Kentucky, near places where giant skeletons have been found. The hunt for giant clues only gets stranger. Throughout Indiana, many ancient forts were built, using both earth and stone in their construction, but most of them have something in common. At Merrim, Indiana, above the Wabash River, Fort Azatlan had a stone wall about 4 feet tall, documented in the 1870s. Browning Mountain at Nashville, Indiana, had a stone wall about 4 feet tall across the hillside. Near Deputy, Indiana, there were 2 stone walls standing in the 1870s. One was 75 feet long, and the other 425 feet long. Both were about 4 feet tall. In fact, most of these so-called forts had walls about 4 feet tall, tall enough to keep in livestock. And if you're only about 5 feet tall, which was the average. You have around a foot of headspace to scan the land for dangers. You also see this in the earthworks of Ohio, such as Fort Ancient, as well as the Newark earthworks. None of these are very tall, but this is not the case along the Ohio River in Indiana. They are considerably taller. At Charlestown State Park, a hillside fort was discovered in the late 1700s and studied by the state of Indiana in 1873. These stone walls averaged about 14 feet tall. While most of the stone was used for later building projects, you can still see evidence of the stacked stone mentioned in the 1873 report. At Evansville's Angel Mounds archaeological site, Dr. Black found remnants of ancient walls in the 1930s. They surrounded the entire village and stood about 14 feet tall. This is a reproduction. Several questions come to mind. Why are the walls nearly 3 times taller than the average person of that time period? Who were they afraid of? And exactly how tall were they? Fast forward to 1991. Indiana University conducted an excavation of the Clampett Archaeological Site, southeast of Bedford, Indiana. The excavated plaza produced a score of ancient artifacts, from pieces of pottery to concave fluted weapon points, proving its antiquity. But several things about this survey are very strange. The first was the remnant of a very large wall. It didn't fit the profile for people around 5 feet tall. Secondly, unlike most archaeological surveys that post findings in online publications that anyone can read and pictures that can be viewed, the documentation simply isn't there. At the time of the study, there were rumors around Lawrence County that giant skeletons were found at the Clampett site and that it was all being kept quiet. But very often, people fill the empty blanks when they simply don't know what's going on. All we can say is that the silence and lack of data is very unusual. It's time to find actual giants and put the skeptics to rest. Stories passed down by word of mouth, from person to person and generation to generation, are highly unreliable. Things get exaggerated. But what about stories in which something was found and the story was covered in the newspaper a day later? Indiana has many of these type stories. Newcastle, Indiana, 1863. During construction of a road 8 miles southwest of town, a gigantic mound covering 5 acres was destroyed. 12 feet below the surface, a skeleton measuring 8 feet tall was discovered. On its chest was a saucer containing 84 ivory beads. These were thought to be placed in the grave by individual mourners as a sign of respect. Walkerton, Indiana, 1872. On the farm of William Flanagan, where the Little Kankakee and Kankakee rivers meet, was a burial mound between the two, a very common ancient practice. 3 skeletons were found, all facing to the northeast, a female and 2 men. The one male skeleton was noted as being much larger than a modern man. Brewersville, Indiana, 1879. On the Robinson Farm, Indiana State geologists excavated a very large mound, 71 feet in diameter and 5 feet tall. Locals said that it was 30 feet tall before stone was removed for building purposes. Beneath the mound was buried a gigantic skeleton, 9 feet 8 inches tall, wearing a mica necklace. The skeleton was kept at the Keller grist mill in a basket, a curiosity shown to anybody that dropped by to get their grain milled. But in 1937, the mill was destroyed when Sand Creek flooded. The giant ancient bones in a basket vanished into the floodwaters. Muncie, Indiana, 1881. A mound was uncovered, resulting in the discovery of many artifacts and large skeletons. The largest and considered the leader had a thigh bone at least 3 inches larger than a modern 6-foot man, making the skeleton an estimated 7 feet tall. LaGrange, Indiana, 1882. On the farm of Solomon Hedrick, a sizable mound was excavated. It was 30 feet tall and covered 4 acres. But this one was a little different than the others. Not one, but a large number of skeletons were found, each at least 8 feet tall. Also in the grave were many ivory beads and a shield made of bone. Portland, Indiana, 1885. During a gravel excavation from a quarry, large ancient skeletons were removed, having unusual sloping skulls. They were put on display at the county surveyor's office, but their whereabouts today are unknown. Shelbyville, Indiana, 1885. At a gravel pit on Franklin Booth's farm, a farmhand named George Arnold uncovered a gigantic skeleton. It was in a sitting position and facing the east. Upon examination by local authorities, they estimated the skeleton to be at least 9 feet tall. And based upon the wear of the teeth, the giant died at a very old age, perhaps 100 years old. Crawfordsville, Indiana, 1892. In a gravel pit above Sugar Creek, 25 skeletons were found. One was at least 7 feet tall. Anderson, Indiana, 1892. At Mound State Park, among the many impressive mounds, numerous large skeletons were found. The skulls were not only huge, but possessed extra bones behind the ears, about 1.5 inches tall, resembling horns. These might have been ancient body modifications. However, the skeletons disintegrated when exposed to air. Shelbyville, Indiana, 1893. On the west bank of the Big Blue River, a very large mound was discovered. It was 75 feet tall, and inside, a skeleton between 8 and 9 feet tall, with its skull facing east. Walkerton, Indiana, 1925. Beneath a large mound were found 8 large skeletons, each about 8 to 9 feet tall. Strangely, they were arranged like the spokes of a wagon wheel. Each skeleton was adorned with substantial copper armor. The largest had a flint arrowhead embedded in the skull, suggesting a long-forgotten battle. But the whereabouts of these giant skeletons, all of them, are unknown today. They were taken to the county museums, courthouse lobbies, or sent to the Smithsonian for analysis. But just like the many giant skeletons found in Ohio and Kentucky, they're simply gone and unaccounted for. Nobody seems to know what happened to them. It certainly seems like a cover-up, but there might be another reason that giant skeletons aren't in museums today. And that reason is buried in an 1879 government report. Some of the earliest reports of giant skeletons had a peculiar end. After being exposed to air, they disintegrated into dust. For most of us, that's a red flag. That maybe we've just heard a fairy tale. But maybe that's just because we don't have all the information. At least, Not until now. What has been well documented are the complex layers of ancient North American burial mounds, especially of the older Adena variety. While there were variations, it usually started below ground with a burial chamber, followed by layers of gravel, ash, clay, and sometimes even a stone exterior. If a casual observer looked at these as a cross-section, they might assume that they'd found a kiln. Or, in the case of modern mortuaries, a crematorium. But even in modern crematoriums, bones are so hard that they don't burn up. They are crushed into a fine powder by a special machine. But something else might be at play. We know from modern giants like Robert Wadlow, who was 8 feet and 11 inches, and Indiana native Sandy Allen, whom was 7 feet and 7 inches, that gigantism often comes at a very steep price: brittle bones. Both Robert and Sandy ended up handicapped from their condition, caused by an overactive pituitary gland. Bones that are already brittle, combined with a burial in a superheated kiln, could explain a skeleton that would fall apart when exposed to air. It's a plausible theory, but is there any evidence? According to the 1879 Indiana Geology Report, Dr. J.B. Gerard found 30 burial mounds along the bluffs of Lowry Creek at Aurora. He excavated many of them, finding the typical layers of rock and ashes, but curiously, no skeletons. These were not ceremonial or platform mounds, and had never been excavated, begging the question, why would a burial mound have no bones? It could absolutely validate the brittle bone cremation theory. That is, if only the ash could have been tested. That was about 150 years ago. Throughout history, we've had giant stories, from the biblical story of the giant Goliath, who also had 4 equally large brothers, the Nephilim, that were part human and part fallen angel, to those going all the way back to the earliest Sumerian culture. Giant stories have been around forever. But many of these stories claim that not only were they giants, they also possessed advanced knowledge and technologies. Case in point, the mound builders at Anderson. They had an advanced understanding of astronomy, building a gigantic earthwork complex, accurately predicting solstices, equinoxes, and other celestial events, all with mathematical precision. At least one giant skeleton was found among the earthworks, and this is where a lot of conspiracy theories start. The assumption is that if giant people were buried near a complex place, they must have a secret knowledge that a government wants to suppress. But just because an ancient people knew where the stars were located and how they moved, doesn't mean they had a dangerous knowledge that we shouldn't. Since my first film about giant legends a few years ago, not much has changed. I asked viewers to send me pictures of any ancient giant skeleton in the world, in any museum, along with an address. A few people claimed that they had the smoking gun, but I never received a single picture. There are museums that display skeletons affected by gigantism, places like the Bone Museum in Brooklyn, New York, but none of them are ancient. But every one of them tell the same story: an overactive pituitary gland, brittle bones, short lives. When unusually tall people do appear in the archaeological record, they're almost always surrounded by people of normal height. By everything we've found, they were the exception and not the rule. And yet, something just seems off and missing. the bones that disintegrated, the skeletons that were on display at courthouses and museums and disappeared, the very large weapons, the very tall defensive walls, the islands covered with skeletons, blasted apart or flooded, totally erasing history. Maybe the mystery isn't if giants existed, but rather what other knowledge was lost with them.